Ned, are you okay? That looked like a nasty fall. Yeah, dude, I'm fine. Who was the girl who bumped into you? No clue.
Peter looked after the girl in question. A flash of messy brown hair was visible for just a moment before disappearing into the crowd completely. He turned his attention back to Ned a moment later.
You sure you're good? Yeah, I'm fine, Peter. Ned rubbed his wrists with his eyebrows scrunched together. She just pulled really hard, Caught me off guard, I guess. Yeah, okay. Peter glanced at his watch. Thanks, Mr. Stark. We should probably get to class. I miss enough school as it is. Alright, man. Sounds good.
Peter trailed a few feet behind Ned, staring just ahead of him at the feet of the other students before the two were in their classroom. Ned began to head to their normal seats when Peter noticed something. The two friends sat in the back of the classroom, with only one table left behind them. But Peter suddenly noticed, for the first time, the person that sat there was the same girl that had bumped into Ned a few minutes ago. The girl seemed to be fiddling around with a box that kind of looked like the box that held new pairs of earrings that Tony bought for Pepper. She was tense for a few moments as she seemed to press behind her ears, but as soon as she had pushed down on something in the tattered box, her shoulders suddenly relaxed. Peter furrowed his eyebrows at her. Questions flooded his brain, but he sat down next to Ned and tried not to focus on the strange girl with the brown hair that apparently sat right behind him. Peter glanced behind him at the strange girl for a moment. Just as the teacher introduced the lesson, she had glanced up from her notebook with a surprising amount of interest as the bell rang, and the teacher made his way to the front of the room. As soon as the man said law of science, though, she sagged back into her seat, moved her eyes back to the paper in front of her, and seemed to completely ignore the lesson entirely. Every few minutes, Peter found his gaze falling back on the girl behind him for a moment. She soon began to hold her book closer to herself, tilting it in a way to where he couldn't see it. He heard her murmur a few words under her breath occasionally, which he easily picked up on with his enhanced hearing. Gonna need to talk to one of the triplets about getting one of those. Does Allie still have an extra one of those? Oh, maybe I could switch that one out. I'm making this too difficult for myself. Peter didn't understand what she was talking about, but it seemed to be about some of her friends. The idea surprised him a bit, as she didn't seem like the kind of person to make friends with people at the school. And so the answer will be 32 degrees, Mr. Examiner finished, quickly circling his final answer. Peter wrote down the process on the board, making sure he had every detail because even if he was a smart kid, he wasn't an expert. He jumped a little when he heard the voice behind him. That's wrong. The eyes of every person in the room flew to her. Her cheeks seemed to heat up at the sudden attention, but she didn't back down. Her eyes locked onto the teacher, her eyebrows raised. Excuse me? Mr. Examiner asked, clearly flustered and annoyed. You heard me. That's wrong. The girl's voice was monotone as she used her pencil to point up at the equation on the board that the older man had just finished demonstrating how to solve. And why is that, miss? Mr. Examiner had a hint of irritation in his words as he spoke. You didn't include the minus, she spoke, extending her arms and using the eraser of her pencil to point to where she was referring. She dragged out the word as she scribbled on her paper and jabbed a few buttons on her calculator before speaking again. 57 degrees. Mr. Examiner and the rest of the class stared at her for a moment while Peter mentally berated himself for not noticing. He had written it down in his notes, even if he knew better and probably would have blindly used it when studying. He had even used these formulas just last night when designing with Mr. Stark, and now here he was writing them down wrong to use for those mandatory study sessions that Mr. Stark and May had now out in place for him. Finally, the teacher snapped out of his gaze and scrambled for a piece of paper. He took a few moments to redo the problem before looking back up, embarrassment clear on his face as he spoke. Yes, you would be correct, Lane. The teenage girl is called Lane, apparently, but Examiner was known for using people's last names to address them. That was probably her last name instead. In the back of the room had a small glimpse of a smile appear on her lips before she turned her attention back to the notebook in front of her. seeming to once again lose all interest in the world around her. For the rest of class, Lane continued her process of whatever she was doing as she had before, while Mr. Examiner continued to teach the lesson, though a bit slower as he double-checked everything he did. Formulas, steps, everything. Peter paid a lot more attention than the mindless way he had before, or at least tried to, even though it was a bit difficult, as he couldn't stop himself from constantly looking back at the strange girl. As soon as class was over, she pulled out the small broken earring box she had had before and began pushing her finger down on something inside of it. As Peter stood up, he noticed that the box was totally black on the bottom and seemed to be some sort of control panel. Peter's mind immediately flew to the first conclusion. Holy shit, she's a supervillain! He realized a few moments later that his idea had zero merits, and he banished it to the back of his mind. Even so, what was that box? And, more importantly, who was this girl? Peter, I love you. But stop calling us strange girl! If anything, we're unique girl or smart girl, okay? Okay. This chapter was so funny to me. Like, Shay just corrected the teacher. She was just like, no, A over A and C over C. Not A over C and C over A. Like, no! You're wrong, teacher. And I was like, oh my god, you are amazing! And for some reason, I kept calling Ned Neb. Like, why? I'm so sorry, buddy. Stay tuned for chapter 3. Okay, bye. Woo.